Hey everybody, friends and family. Last time I did a conference presentation, I did a run through on a video, put it up on YouTube, and it was really helpful for me, and I got some pretty good feedback too. And so I've got another one coming up next week, Southeastern Psychological Association. And so I just decided to try it again. And this is my second run through because it went way too long the first time. So this is the research I've been working on over the last few months, and I've been doing it with my brother Thomas and my mentor Michael Nielsen, who's the department chair here at Georgia Southern University Psych Department. So here it is, predictors of attitudes toward migrant farm workers and related groups in two samples. So basically this is a study about how people feel about migrant farm workers. So if you're interested in that, keep going. If not, you can find something else. A lot of cool stuff on YouTube, the Beatles, for one. Okay. So migrant farm workers. Who are migrant farm workers? Okay, just so in brief, migrant farm workers are kind of the backbone of agricultural work in the United States. It's a really hard job, but they work at really low wages, and they're brought in mostly from Mexico to work on our crops. They're cutting our onions, they're picking our apples. And I became interested in migrant farm workers partly because my brother has worked with them, but also because, there's been a lot of political rhetoric about people coming into the United States. Migrant farm workers kind of occupy a weird, unique niche in the country that doesn't really fit in with refugees or other types of immigrants. So that's what kind of inspired me to do this study. Real quick, the definition is a worker who's required to be absent from permanent place of residence for the purpose of agricultural work. Basically, they're agricultural workers that are brought in from a different place to work in our agricultural system. They can be documented or undocumented. There is a special visa granted to them to do this work. So there are a lot of people that come in legally to do this work, but also there are undocumented immigrants who are also farm workers. And we don't know what the ratio is because by virtue of some of them being undocumented, we don't have numbers and we can't track them. So characteristics of farm work. Agricultural work is really dangerous. And people that do that work, they operate heavy machinery, they spray pesticides and fertilizers, they work out in the hot sun, sometimes without adequate water. There's sanitation problems a lot of times. So this is dangerous physical work, and it's also risky mental health-wise. Some research has shown that between 40 to 50% of migrant farm workers qualify for some kind of depressive disorder, major depression or otherwise. And also anxiety disorders have a similarly high percentage. I mean, almost half. That's a lot bigger than the general population. So this is a group that's particularly at risk for mental health problems. A lot of causes, possibly stress, family and cultural separation, educational disruption, financial disruption, poverty, just demands of the work. But also there's evidence that those migrant farm workers that are in closer contact with American society and are more acculturated to American society are actually worse off mental health-wise. Now that's kind of a weird finding. You'd think that if they fit in better, they'd be better, have better mental health, but it's actually not the case. It's the opposite. So there's a few theories behind that, but one of the theories is, being in contact with Americans actually puts them at risk of stigma, prejudice, discrimination acts, violent acts that might be discriminatory. So kind of leaves an open research question. How do Americans feel about migrant farm workers? So there's this theory that maybe contact with Americans and discrimination from Americans is causing these mental health problems. Well, how do Americans feel about migrant farm workers? Do they like them? Do they not like them? Do they not care? Do they feel the same as they do about Hispanic Americans in general? Or do they think of migrant farm workers as illegal immigrants, basically? So, or undocumented workers? So that was my research question. Can we ask Americans how they feel about migrant farm workers and compare it to how they feel about other related groups and come to a conclusion about that? So I took 2 survey samples and just real basic. There was an online sample that was just survey workers from all over the United States. Not exactly like a really representative group, but I'd need thousands and thousands of people to do that. So this was actually just 400 something for both students and this online sample. Students were just from my university, and they were undergraduates. The online sample was a little older, and the demographic characteristics were slightly different. I'll go over that later. This is part of my dissertation, which was a larger study on political attitudes in general. So this was just a piece of my dissertation. And this is just a map of all the participants in my study. And I worked really hard on it. It was really hard to do, so I wanted to put it in here. 2 people from Montreal got into the map, but I took them out of the data, so don't worry about that. Okay. So I was thinking, so what are some psychological or personality variables that might influence how people think about migrant farm workers? What could they be? Well, I made a big list of things that in previous research have been connected in some way to prejudice, possibly. The evidence is stronger or weaker for a few of these. 1, affect. How does your mood influence how you feel about people? And the instrument I used kind of measures people's positive mood and negative mood that they're feeling at any given time. Second thing is psychological inflexibility. I could go into that if you want, but I'm not going to because it didn't turn out predictive and it's kind of complicated. But it's there. I measured it using the AAQ2. Religiosity. There's mixed research on whether religiousness correlates with prejudice. And so I put that in there because it was a personal interest of mine. I wanted to know whether or not there was a correlation there. Political orientation is probably a no-brainer. I mean, whether you're liberal or conservative will probably influence how you feel about immigrants or migrants, especially in the last couple of years. I put demographic variables, education, income, sex, age. And then geographic variables. This was interesting to me. It was kind of new. I'd never done anything like this before, but we got census data, and we actually included data on every person that took the survey, how many farm workers are located in their county per capita, whether it's an urban or a rural county, and we just did that by population, so how many people are located in their county. And then finally, how many Hispanic Americans are in their county per capita. So does that influence how they feel about migrant farm workers? So the way that we measured this is we had them do all those surveys about their mood and demographics and all that. And then we asked them, basically, how do you feel about the following things? Big list of different people, groups, brands, Abercrombie and Fitch, Walgreens, but then ethnic and religious groups like Jews, African Americans. How do you feel about Donald Trump? How do you feel about Vladimir Putin? How do you feel about George W. Bush? But the 4 that we were interested in that seemed to be somewhat related to migrant farm workers were Mexican migrant farm workers. That's the thing that we were looking for. Hispanic Americans, illegal immigrants, and refugees. Now, a word about illegal immigrants. So I included that in here. It's kind of an offensive term to a lot of people, and we realized that, but we included it in here because we want to know how people respond to that label. So when we put that, it's a very controversial, kind of punchy term. How does that label make people feel? So we included it for a reason. We just put it on a slider, and we used warm or cold because previous research does that. So do you feel cold towards this group, or do you feel warm towards this group? 0 to 100, the default was set at 50. So here are the general demographics. Really the takeaway that you need to know is that the student sample leaned slightly conservative. The online sample was a little more normal. I think it skewed a little bit liberal. Household income in the online sample, it was kind of normal, skewed a little bit on the poverty side, which makes sense because they're taking surveys online for money, so they're probably not CEOs of a company, but can't know that for sure. With students, I don't know. I should have done that differently because I think some answered for their own income, and then some answered for their family income. So I don't trust that variable very much for the students. Then educational level. Obviously, the students are going to have less education than those that are, in their older 30s. So here's the first chart of results. So we've got the 4 labels here: Hispanic Americans, refugees, Mexican migrant farm workers, illegal immigrants. Kind of a predictable pattern here. So Hispanic Americans, we get the highest ratings of warmth. So they feel better about Hispanic Americans. They feel the worst about illegal immigrants. They feel very cold toward that group. Makes sense. It's a controversial term. It's kind of stigmatizing label. Mexican migrant farm workers are kind of in between. And they didn't differ significantly from refugees, but they did from Hispanic Americans and illegal immigrants. So, first conclusion we can make is that Mexican migrant farm workers kind of occupy this weird intermediate space in people's minds. Well, they're not exactly the same as just Hispanic Americans because they're here in an unusual circumstance, but they're not illegal immigrants because there's kind of in-between legal status for these people, for some of them. Some of them are illegal. So it makes sense that people would kind of have this in-between feeling about them. And that's borne out by the data. So in the student sample, we were just looking, okay, so which of all those psychological factors predicted how they feel about all the groups? And what we found was that political conservatism was negatively correlated with warmth toward all 4 groups. So all of the different groups, the more conservative you were, the colder you felt toward those groups. And liberals felt warm toward those groups. For just the illegal immigrants, I put aliens there, but it should be immigrants, income was negatively correlated, meaning the more money you make, the colder you felt towards illegal immigrants. Kind of makes sense on an intuitive level. Now the other stuff was significant. Okay. Then in the online sample, we could include all those geographical variables and county level data. So that was interesting. We got a little bit more interesting results. So for Hispanic Americans, same thing with conservatism. More conservative people felt colder towards Hispanic Americans. The better mood you were in, the better you felt. That makes sense. Higher religiosity resulted in higher feelings toward these groups. So if you're more religious, you feel better about Hispanic Americans. Female sex was significant, but only in one certain circumstance, and that became non-significant. Everything else, including demographic and geographic variables, not predictive. So for refugees, what were the predictors? Now, this is an interesting one because of politics right now. So education. As education and religiosity, the higher those were, the warmer you felt towards refugees. That's interesting. But the more conservative you were, the colder you felt. That's interesting because conservatism and religiosity are correlated, but they have opposite effects. So already we're starting to see evidence that there might be, in conservatives, there might actually be these 2 different motivations or groups. One might be the more secular conservative, and one might be the more religious conservative. Maybe. It's a hypothesis. For Mexican migrant farm workers, here's the main thing of our study. The only thing that was predictive was conservatism. Same result. Conservatives like migrant farm workers less. Illegal immigrants, political conservatives, same thing. A couple more things. Education, negative affect, and religiosity. So the higher those factors were in general, the higher they were, the higher people felt towards illegal immigrants. Everything else not significant. So what conclusions can we draw from this? So like I said before, Mexican migrant farm workers occupy an intermediate space in people's consciousness between illegal immigrants who are here completely illegally and Hispanic Americans. And the number one thing that kept coming up was political orientation. Conservatives like this group less, liberals like this group more. And that was consistent across all groups in both the students that I sampled and across the nation of those that I sampled. Now, one little interesting thing that I brought up was religiosity was significantly predictive of better feelings toward 3 of the 4 groups, but not migrant farm workers. Okay, so there's this weird thing about being religious actually increased your feelings toward these groups. Okay, so what were some limitations? It was an online sample of survey takers. I'm not comfortable saying it's representative of the whole country as a whole, but it's still better than just a student sample, which is usually what's taken for university research. So we got a little bit better data than we would just doing a university sample. We used geographic variables as proxies for contact. I don't know. There's various research on that. Some research says that, yeah, you can do that. But just because a lot of migrant farm workers live in your county doesn't mean you've met any or that you like them or that you've been around them very much. Future research. So based on the results of this research, we're doing another wave of data right now. And what we're trying to find out, because political orientation kept coming up as predictive of feelings toward all the different groups, including just Hispanic Americans, we started to think, what does it mean to be a liberal or a conservative? And there's some theory, like moral foundations theory, that suggests that being liberal or conservative actually breaks down into more fundamental beliefs about morality. So our current research is finding out which of those sub-foundations actually are driving the effect that we're seeing. We're finding some really interesting stuff there that kind of goes along with what I hinted at, and that is that among conservatives, there's a dual identity problem, that you can't just talk about all conservatives in one way. Those conservatives that are more religious actually have different motivations than those conservatives that aren't very religious. And that's my study. So if you have any questions or comments, please let me know. And otherwise, have a good night or day or whenever you watch this. Bye.